An elderly black man, Elijah Carter, walked into the courtroom clutching a photograph of his late wife, Ruth. At 75 years old, Elijah wasn't just fighting for his land, he was defending the legacy his family had built since emancipation. But when Judge Gregory Harrow, known for his ties to corrupt developers, dismissed his case without so much as a glance at the evidence, the courtroom's indifference was deafening. What no one realized was that Elijah had a plan, a strategy meticulously orchestrated by Ruth before her passing. What Elijah did next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events that would expose years of corruption, bring powerful men to their knees, and ignite a movement that resonated far beyond the courtroom. Stay tuned, because this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today and if you find this story as powerful as we do. Make sure to subscribe for more tales of resilience, justice, and triumph. The old courthouse sat heavy under the gray Baltimore sky, its imposing facade bearing witness to decades of stories untold and injustices unseen. Inside courtroom 307, the air was thick with an uneasy quiet, the kind that settles when everyone knows the ending, but no one wants to say it aloud. Charles Kingston sat stiffly on a wooden bench, his worn hands clutching a faded photograph of Gloria, his wife of 50 years. Her smile, eternal in the photograph, was the only light in an otherwise cold and indifferent room. Charles had dressed carefully that morning. His best suit, navy blue and neatly pressed, carried the weight of memory. Gloria had always insisted he present himself with dignity, no matter the circumstances. His tie, a gift from her, felt like an anchor. At 78, Charles moved slowly, his once proud frame bent slightly from years of labor and heartbreak. But his eyes remained sharp, a quiet fire smoldering behind wire-rimmed glasses. The courtroom buzzed with restrained chaos. Lawyers, clad in sharp suits, shuffled papers and whispered hurriedly to their assistants. A young man in a public defender's badge sat next to Charles, his face pale with inexperience, his briefcase overstuffed with files he hadn't yet had time to read. Opposite them, the representatives from Central Horizon, a development company cloaked in legitimacy, whispered among themselves with barely concealed smirks. Their tailored suits and polished shoes spoke of wealth, power, and the privilege of knowing the system would always lean their way. "All rise," the bailiff called, his voice breaking through the murmurs. Judge Ernest Redding entered, his black robe billowing behind him like a shadow. Redding, a man in his early 60s with steel-gray hair and cold, piercing eyes, carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed his authority was absolute. He barely glanced at Charles as he took his seat. To Redding, Charles Kingston was just another old man clinging to the past. Another case to dismiss before lunch. Case number 3472. Kingston vs. Central Horizon Development. The clerk announced. Charles rose slowly, his knees aching with each movement. The young defender fumbled with his papers. But Charles didn't need him to speak. He had rehearsed his words for months, each syllable a tribute to Gloria and the generations who had built their lives on that land. "Your Honor," Charles began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "That land has been in my family for over a century. My great-grandfather, a freedman, purchased it in 1872. He paid for every acre with money he earned, brick by brick, under the sun." Judge Redding barely glanced up from the file in front of him. "Mr. Kingston, are you aware that property tax laws have changed significantly since 1872? "Yes, Your Honor, but the taxes were paid. My wife Gloria, she kept every record, every receipt. If you'll just look." "Mr. Kingston," Redding interrupted, his tone clipped. "Outdated documents from a different era hardly constitute relevant evidence in this court." The smirk from the Central Horizon lawyer was the only acknowledgement of the dismissal. Charles straightened, the photograph of Gloria trembling slightly in his hand. "Your Honor, this isn't just land, this is our history. My family built their lives there. My wife," his voice broke for the first time, "she spent her last days making sure everything was in order, so our grandchildren would have something to hold on to." "Case dismissed," Redding declared, his gavel cracking like thunder through the courtroom. The finality of the sound hung in the air as Charles stood frozen, the weight of generations bearing down on him. Behind him, whispers filled the gallery. "They always want something for nothing. A man muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. Ancient history. Another scoffed. Charles turned slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd. No one met his gaze. They looked past him, through him, as if his pain and his history were invisible. As he shuffled out of the courtroom, the photograph of Gloria still clutched to his chest. A young woman caught his eye. Joanna Harris, a journalist with a notebook in hand, watched the proceedings with a mix of frustration and determination. She wasn't like the other reporters chasing headlines. She had seen the quiet injustices, the slow erosion of dignity that came not with shouts but with whispers. Her pen moved furiously across the page as she captured every condescending glance, every dismissive gesture. Outside, the autumn air bit at Charles's cheeks as he sat on a stone bench near the courthouse steps. His body felt as heavy as the world he carried, but his mind churned with memories. Gloria's voice echoed in his ears, "Don't you ever give up. Charles Kingston, not while you have breath in your body." Before he could sink further into despair, a familiar voice broke through his thoughts. "Grandpa," Marcus called, hurrying up the steps. His presence was a stark contrast to the cold indifference of the courtroom. Tall and confident, with the quiet strength of someone who had seen enough to know better. Marcus sat beside his grandfather. "What happened in there?" he asked softly. Charles shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "The judge didn't even look at the evidence. Marcus didn't care about the receipts, the deed, or Gloria's work. None of it mattered." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then we make it matter," he said firmly. "This isn't over, Grandpa, not by a long shot." From across the plaza, Joanna watched them. She could see the weight of the moment in their posture, the legacy they were trying to protect. She made a note in her journal. "This isn't a story about land. It's about history, memory, and a system built to erase them." And as the day faded into evening, the first threads of resistance began to weave together. Quiet but unyielding, like a whisper that promised to grow louder with time. If you stand with Elijah Carter's courage and believe in fighting for justice and preserving family legacies, press 1 to show your support. The scent of Gloria's favorite magnolias lingered in the air as Charles Kingston sat alone in his modest apartment that evening. The faint hum of the city outside his window was a stark reminder of a world that moved on. Indifferent to the struggles of an old man, on the mantel above the fireplace, Gloria's photograph rested, her gentle smile a source of strength. Even in her absence, Charles unfolded the yellow deed to their land, running his fingers over the faded ink. Each line told a story, one of hard work, perseverance, and pride. His great-grandfather, Jeremiah Kingston, had saved for years to buy those 40 acres after gaining his freedom. That land wasn't just soil, it was their roots, their identity. Now, it was slipping away, not because of failure, but because of something far more insidious, a system designed to take what was never freely given. A knock at the door pulled Charles from his thoughts. Standing on the threshold was Marcus, his grandson, holding a laptop under one arm and a look of determination on his face. "Grandpa, we need to talk," Marcus said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "This isn't over. It can't be." Charles sighed, gesturing toward the worn couch. "Sit, son. I don't know what we can do. That judge," his voice trailed off, heavy with defeat. "That judge was never going to listen," Marcus replied, setting his laptop on the coffee table. "But we're not fighting just him. We're fighting an entire system that's been stealing from families like ours for generations." Charles frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus opened the laptop, revealing a map of the neighborhood they'd called home for decades. Bright red dots marked properties that had been foreclosed or seized. "Look at this. It's not just us. Central Horizon has been targeting black families for years. They manipulate tax records, falsify paperwork, and then hide behind the courts." Charles leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "How do you know this?" "I've been digging," Marcus admitted. "Every foreclosure in the last 10 years has the same pattern, and it always ends with Central Horizon taking over." Before Charles could respond, another knock echoed through the apartment. This time, it was Joanna Harris, the young journalist from the courthouse. Her notebook and recorder were in hand, her expression a mix of curiosity and urgency. "Mr. Kingston, I hope I'm not intruding," she began, stepping inside after Marcus waved her in. "I couldn't stop thinking about what happened in court today. Something about it felt wrong." "Felt wrong?" Charles echoed bitterly. It was wrong. Joanna nodded, taking a seat across from him. I want to help tell your story. People need to know what's happening not just to you, but to everyone Central Horizon is targeting. Why do you care? Charles asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Because this isn't justice, Joanna replied, and because my grandfather fought for the same kind of land. He lost his battle, but maybe I can help you win yours. The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Charles studied her face, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, he nodded slowly. All right, but if you're going to do this, you need to understand what we're up against. The following day, Marcus, Joanna, and Charles began retracing the history of the Kingston land. They combed through old family records stored in Gloria's meticulously organized boxes. Receipts, deeds, and letters painted a picture of a family that had worked tirelessly to hold onto what was theirs. Gloria knew, Charles murmured as he sifted through the papers. She saw this coming. Joanna tilted her head. What do you mean? She said they'd try to take it someday. Charles explained. She started making copies of everything, sending them to family members. Said it was the only way to keep the truth alive. As the day wore on, they uncovered more than just documents. Stories emerged, stories of how Charles's father had fought to pay rising property taxes during the Great Depression. How his mother had grown and sold vegetables from the land to keep the family afloat. The land wasn't just a possession, it was a testament to survival. But the more they uncovered, the more the reality of their fight became clear. Central Horizon wasn't just a corporation, it was an empire. Its lawyers were ruthless, its connections deep. Joanna found herself poring over court records late into the night, uncovering a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Charles's case. It's not just about the land, Joanna said one evening, her voice filled with frustration. They're using these foreclosures to gentrify entire neighborhoods. They're erasing history. Charles leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched into his face. Then how do we stop them? We start by finding the cracks. Marcus interjected, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Every system has weaknesses. We just have to expose theirs. The first crack appeared 2 weeks later. Marcus discovered discrepancies in the tax records Central Horizon had used to justify the foreclosure. Payments marked as missing had actually been made, and receipts Gloria had saved proved it. But when Joanna attempted to verify the information with the city's tax office, she was met with hostility. These records are sealed, the clerk told her curtly, refusing to make eye contact. You'll need a court order. Joanna returned to the apartment that evening, frustration simmering beneath her professional facade. They're stonewalling us, she said. Someone doesn't want this information getting out. Marcus looked up from his laptop. Then we make it impossible for them to hide. Grandpa, do you still have Gloria's letters? The ones she sent to her sister in Georgia? Charles nodded. Why? Because if she sent copies of these documents, we might still have a way to prove everything. That night, as the city settled into an uneasy quiet, the Kingston apartment buzzed with a sense of purpose. But beneath the determination, a gnawing tension grew. They were uncovering truths that powerful people wanted buried. And the deeper they dug, the more dangerous their fight became. In the shadows of a system built to erase them, Charles, Marcus, and Joanna prepared for the battles ahead. Gloria's voice echoed in Charles's mind as he looked at her photograph on the mantel. Don't let them take what we built. Charles, not without a fight. And this time, he wouldn't. The first call came just after dawn. Charles had barely poured his coffee when the shrill ring of the phone shattered the quiet of his morning. He answered it, expecting the familiar voice of Marcus or perhaps Joanna with an update. Instead, a smooth, detached tone greeted him. Mr. Kingston, the voice began, too polite to feel genuine. This is a courtesy call to remind you that pursuing baseless claims against Central Horizon is a waste of valuable time and resources for you and everyone involved. Charles tightened his grip on the receiver. Who is this? Just someone who appreciates the value of moving forward. The voice replied, the faintest edge of menace creeping in. Let the past rest, Mr. Kingston. It's best for everyone. The line went dead before Charles could respond. His heart thudded in his chest. Not from fear, but from anger, a deep, seething anger that had grown over decades of being dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated. He slammed the phone down and stared at the photograph of Gloria on the mantel. her steady gaze reminding him why he couldn't afford to back down. Later that morning, Joanna arrived, her brow furrowed as she placed a thick folder of research on the coffee table. "I've been digging into Central Horizon's board of directors," she said, pulling out a list of names. "They're tied to half the city's major developments over the past 20 years. And guess who signed off on nearly every project?" "Judge Redding," Marcus interjected, walking in with his laptop. He had been tracking court records all night and looked as though he hadn't slept. "He's been ruling in their favor for years. Property disputes, environmental clearances, zoning adjustments, you name it." Charles shook his head. "And no one's ever questioned him?" Joanna sighed. "That's the thing about power, Mr. Kingston. When you're on top, people assume you belong there. And when you look like Redding, wealthy, white, connected well, that assumption comes even easier." The room fell into a heavy silence. It was an unspoken truth that hung in the air, one that every black family in America knew too well. The rules were never written for them. The game was rigged from the start. By afternoon, the tension had begun to build. Marcus's discovery of an email chain between Central Horizon executives revealed more than just corruption. It hinted at something darker. "They're not just targeting individual properties," Marcus explained, scrolling through his findings. "They're systematically dismantling entire neighborhoods. It's all here: tax hikes, utility shutoffs, fabricated code violations. They create conditions so unbearable that families either sell cheap or face foreclosure." Joanna leaned over his shoulder. "They're turning history into profit," she said quietly. "And it's not just happening here. This is a blueprint they've used in cities across the country." Charles stood, his fists clenched at his sides. "This land isn't just dirt and grass to them. Or to us," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's everything we built, everything we fought for. And they think they can just erase it?" As the sun dipped below the horizon, the battle lines began to blur into danger. Marcus's phone buzzed with a series of anonymous messages, each one more threatening than the last. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it," one read. Joanna's car, parked outside the apartment, had its tires slashed. When she reported the incident, the officer who arrived took one look at her and shrugged. "Probably kids," he said dismissively, writing a report that seemed destined for the bottom of a filing cabinet. The reality of their fight began to sink in. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a war against a machine that thrived on intimidation and fear. That night, Charles sat at his kitchen table, the house eerily quiet. Marcus had gone home, and Joanna was working from her own apartment. But their absence left a hollow ache in the space. He thumbed through Gloria's old diary, her neat handwriting a comforting presence. "They'll always try to take what's ours," she had written years ago. "But what they don't understand is that our strength doesn't come from the land. It comes from us, from the stories we carry, from the love we share, from the fight we refuse to give up." Her words lit a fire in him. He picked up the phone and called Marcus. "Son," he said, his voice steady, "we're going to keep fighting. I don't care what they try to scare us with. They don't get to win." The next day, their resolve was tested further. Joanna received a visit from a man in an expensive suit as she left her apartment. "Ms. Harris," he began, blocking her path, "you're a bright journalist. You got a promising future. But digging into Central Horizon isn't the hill you want to die on." Joanna squared her shoulders, her voice calm but firm. "If you're trying to scare me, it's not working." "Good," the man replied with a smirk. "Because we're not trying yet." He handed her an envelope and walked away. Inside were photographs, pictures of Joanna leaving Charles's apartment, of Marcus at his office, and even of Charles sitting on his porch. The message was clear: "We're watching." By the week's end, the pressure was suffocating. Charles's neighbors, already wary of the attention the case had brought, began to distance themselves. A knock at the door revealed Mrs. Simmons, who had lived next door for decades. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "Charles," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "You've got to stop this. These people, they don't play fair. My cousin in the next town lost everything trying to fight them." Charles placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They don't scare me, Mary, and they shouldn't scare you either. We've been through worse." She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "Worse didn't take our homes." That night, as rain lashed against the windows, the Kingston apartment felt like a fortress under siege. But in the quiet, there was also a steely determination, a refusal to give in. Charles looked at Marcus and Joanna, his allies in this fight, and saw the same fire burning in their eyes. They think they can scare us into silence, Joanna said, breaking the silence, but we've already come too far to turn back. Marcus nodded, and if they're this desperate to stop us, it means we're onto something big. Charles leaned back in his chair, Gloria's words echoing in his mind. Don't let them take what's ours. He spoke with quiet conviction. Let's show them what they've underestimated. As thunder rumbled in the distance, the stage was set. The fight was no longer just for the land, it was for history. For justice. For the right to exist in a world that seemed determined to erase them. And no matter the cost, the Kingstons weren't backing down. The first rays of dawn crept through the curtains as Charles Kingston sat at his kitchen table. Gloria's diary opened before him. Her words, scrawled in firm, determined handwriting, seemed to leap off the page. The fight for what's right is never easy, Charles, but it's a fight worth having. He traced the words with a weathered finger, drawing strength from her conviction. Marcus burst through the door, his laptop tucked under one arm and a triumphant glint in his eyes. Grandpa, he said, dropping into a chair, I found something, and it's big. Charles leaned forward, his brow furrowed. What is it, son? Marcus opened his laptop and pulled up a series of scanned documents. Central Horizon didn't just falsify your tax records. They've done it to dozens of families. Look at this. He pointed to a series of transactions that showed inflated tax bills and missing payments, all tied to properties now owned by the company. See that name? Marcus asked, tapping the screen. A shell corporation. And here another one. They're all tied back to Central Horizon. Before Charles could respond, Joanna Harris arrived, her recorder and notepad in hand. Morning, she said, setting her things on the table. I've been going through old court records. Every single case Judge Redding has ruled on involving Central Horizon has gone their way. Every single one. The room grew quiet as the weight of their findings settled over them. This wasn't just about one family or one judge. This was a system designed to strip communities of their history, their wealth, their very existence. Later that day, Charles, Marcus, and Joanna visited some of the families affected by Central Horizon schemes. The first stop was Mrs. Ethel Price, an elderly widow who had lived in her home for over 50 years. Her front yard was overgrown, her shutters faded, but the pride in her voice was unshakable. They came knocking last year, Mrs. Price said, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. Said I owed back taxes. I showed them my receipts, but they said it wasn't enough. 2 months later, I got an eviction notice. Charles's heart ached as he listened. Did you try to fight it? Mrs. Price nodded, tears welling in her eyes. What could I do? They had lawyers. All I had were memories. From house to house, the stories were the same families forced out by forged documents, court rulings that felt predetermined, and a system that seemed to conspire against them. Each account added fuel to the fire burning within Charles, Marcus, and Joanna. By evening, the three gathered in Charles's living room, the table covered in papers, photographs, and notes. The mood was tense, the weight of their discoveries heavy on their shoulders. They've been doing this for decades, Joanna said, her voice tight, and no one stopped them because they think no one cares. Well, someone does now, Marcus replied, his tone defiant, and we're going to make them care. Charles looked between the two of them, pride and determination swelling within him. But we can't do it alone, he said. We need the community. The next day, they held a meeting at the local church. Word had spread quickly, and the pews were filled with faces both familiar and new. Elderly residents sat beside young activists, their shared anger and determination bridging the generational divide. Charles stood at the front, his voice steady but filled with emotion. They've taken from us long enough, he said, holding Gloria's photograph for everyone to see. This land, these homes, they're more than property. They're our history, our lives, and they don't get to erase that. The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder as Marcus stepped forward. He projected the documents he had uncovered onto a screen, explaining how Central Horizon's network of shell corporations had orchestrated the theft of land across the city. Joanna followed, sharing her findings about Judge Redding and the court's complicity. This isn't just corruption, she said, it's a war against us, fought in silence and shadows. But if we stand together, we can bring it to light. The room erupted into applause. The energy palpable. For the first time in years, the community felt a sense of hope, a belief that they could fight back. But hope has a way of attracting enemies. That night, as Charles and Marcus returned home, they found their apartment ransacked. Papers were strewn across the floor, drawers overturned, and Gloria's diary was missing. Marcus clenched his fists, his anger barely contained. "They're trying to scare us." Charles knelt beside the mess, his hand trembling as he picked up a photograph of Gloria that had been torn in two. "They can try," he said quietly, "but they'll never break us." The following days were a whirlwind. Joanna's articles began to gain traction, drawing attention from local news outlets. Protests erupted outside Central Horizon's offices, with signs demanding justice and an end to the exploitation of black communities. The company responded with denials and counterclaims. But the tide was turning. At the same time, the threats grew more intense. Anonymous letters appeared in Charles's mailbox. Marcus received emails warning him to stop digging, and Joanna's editor was pressured to kill the story. "They're desperate," Joanna said during a late-night meeting. "And desperate people make mistakes." As the chapter drew to a close, the stakes had never been higher. The Kingstons and their allies were no longer fighting for just one piece of land, they were fighting for an entire community's right to exist. The walls were closing in, but with every new challenge, their resolve grew stronger. Charles looked at Marcus and Joanna, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Gloria always said the truth has a way of coming to light. Let's make sure it does." And as the city slept, the seeds of justice were sown in the hearts of those who refused to be silenced. The fight had only just begun. The morning after the break-in, Charles Kingston sat on his porch, the fractured photograph of Gloria resting in his lap. The faint hum of the neighborhood seemed quieter than usual, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Across the street, Mrs. Simmons glanced toward him, then quickly looked away, her unease as clear as the autumn sunlight. The message from the intruders was unmistakable: stay silent. Stop fighting. But Charles had long since crossed the point of retreat. His wife's absence hung over him, a reminder of everything they had fought to build together. Her voice seemed to whisper from the edges of his memory, "Don't let fear steal what's ours." Charles. By midday, Marcus arrived, his laptop tucked under his arm and a look of determination etched on his face. "Grandpa," he said, setting up on the dining room table, "I've been tracking some of Central Horizon's financials. They've got skeletons everywhere, they just thought no one would look." Charles raised an eyebrow. "What kind of skeletons?" Marcus tapped at the keyboard, pulling up a series of documents. "Offshore accounts, hidden transactions, payments to officials. These aren't just coincidences, Grandpa. This is organized theft." Before Charles could respond, Joanna Harris arrived, her face flushed from the crisp wind and the growing intensity of their battle. She carried a recorder and a stack of new research. "I've got something," she said, placing the papers on the table. "It's about Judge Redding. He's been quietly receiving donations to a charitable foundation, but it's nothing more than a shell." "And guess who the biggest donor is?" Charles sighed, already knowing the answer. "Central Horizon." Joanna nodded. "They're not just using the courts, they're buying them." The trio spent the afternoon piecing together their findings, the living room becoming a makeshift war room. Marcus's screen glowed with spreadsheets and email threads. Joanna's notes piled high, and Charles's worn hands leafed through Gloria's meticulously preserved records. But as the puzzle came together, the stakes rose. Joanna's phone buzzed with an anonymous message. "Walk away while you can." A glance out the window revealed a black sedan idling at the corner, its occupants hidden behind tinted glass. Marcus muttered under his breath, "They're watching us." Charles stood, his shoulders squared against the pressure. "Let them watch," he said. "They think fear will stop us. But we've seen worse than this." That evening, they called another community meeting at the church. The pews filled quickly, the energy in the room a mix of anger, fear, and determination. Charles stood at the front, Gloria's photograph in his hand. "We've been told to stay quiet," he began, his voice steady, "to accept what's happening because fighting back feels impossible. But my wife Gloria believed in something bigger. She believed in this community, in our history, and in our right to stand tall." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Charles continued, his voice rising, "They don't just want our land. They want our silence. They want us to disappear. But we're still here. And we're not going anywhere. Marcus stepped forward, projecting the evidence onto a screen. Falsified documents, financial records, and connections to Judge Redding. Gasps filled the room as the extent of Central Horizon's corruption became clear. They've been targeting us for years, Marcus said, his voice firm, but we've got the proof. And we're not alone. Joanna followed, her words measured but cutting. This isn't just about one family or one neighborhood. This is about a system that's been stealing from communities like ours for generations. But if we stand together, we can change that. The room erupted in applause. The energy palpable, but beneath the hope was an undercurrent of unease. Everyone knew the risks of defying those in power. The retaliation came swiftly. The next morning, Joanna's car was vandalized again. This time with slur spray painted across the hood. Marcus's email account was hacked. His personal information leaked online. And Charles received another phone call. The same smooth voice delivering a chilling warning. Mr. Kingston, we're disappointed. You've been given every opportunity to resolve this quietly. If you persist, the consequences will be unfortunate. Charles's jaw tightened. You think you can scare me? I've been fighting men like you my whole life. The voice on the other end chuckled. Then you should know how it ends. But even as the threats mounted, so did the support. Word of their fight spread beyond the neighborhood, drawing attention from local activists and journalists. Donations began to trickle in to fund their efforts, and volunteers offered to help organize the growing resistance. Reverend Thompson, the church's pastor, took to the pulpit that Sunday with a fiery sermon. They think they can take what belongs to us, he thundered, but this land holds our blood, our sweat, and our tears, and no corporation, no corrupt judge, can take that away. The congregation rose to their feet, their voices rising in a hymn of defiance. Charles stood among them, the fire in his chest burning brighter than ever. The chapter ended on a knife's edge. As night fell, the community prepared for the battles ahead, knowing the fight would only grow more dangerous. Charles sat on his porch, Gloria's diary in his lap and Marcus by his side. They think they've won, Marcus said quietly. They think they can break us. Charles shook his head. They've already lost. Because we're not fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for everyone who came before us and everyone who'll come after. And in the gathering storm, their resolve became unshakable. The fight for justice was no longer just theirs. It belonged to a community determined to stand against a world that refused to see them. The morning air hung heavy with anticipation as Charles Kingston stood at his kitchen window, watching the sunlight filter through the oak trees that lined his street. The quiet was deceptive, masking the storm that was brewing. Every day brought new threats, new challenges. Yet, every day, the fight grew more urgent, more critical. Marcus arrived shortly after sunrise, his face set with determination. I found something, he said, his voice low but insistent. He placed his laptop on the table, pulling up a series of documents. This isn't just about Central Horizon. They're part of something bigger. Charles frowned. What do you mean? Marcus tapped the screen, pointing to a web of interconnected companies, shell corporations, offshore accounts, and backdoor deals. Central Horizon isn't acting alone. They're part of a network targeting black neighborhoods across the country. It's coordinated. Joanna Harris, who had spent the night at her newsroom following another break-in at her apartment, entered just in time to hear Marcus's revelation. They're turning gentrification into a business model, she said, setting down her notebook. And they're using courts like Judge Redding's to make it look legal. The weight of the discovery was suffocating. This wasn't just about reclaiming a piece of land. This was about exposing a system built to erase communities and rewrite history. Later that day, the trio returned to the church to meet with Reverend Thompson and the community. The pews were fuller than ever, the atmosphere electric with a mix of fear and resolve. The faces in the crowd bore the marks of a shared struggle, lines etched by years of hard work, worry, and quiet endurance. Charles stood at the pulpit, his voice steady but filled with fire. They've taken from us in silence for too long. But silence isn't consent, and we are done being silent. Marcus followed, displaying the evidence he had uncovered. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he detailed the scope of the corruption. Joanna took the stage next, her voice sharp and cutting. This isn't just happening here, she said. It's happening everywhere. And if we don't fight back now, we'll lose more than our homes, we'll lose our history. The murmurs of the crowd grew into a crescendo of determination. Reverend Thompson raised his hands to quiet them. "We've faced giants before," he said, his voice like thunder, "and we've brought them down. But we must stand together. Unity is our strength." That evening, the stakes rose. Marcus received an anonymous email. Its tone both menacing and smug. "You're digging too deep. Walk away while you still can." Attached was a screenshot of his bank account, drained of nearly every dollar. Joanna found herself followed by an unmarked car as she left the church. When she confronted the driver, the window rolled down just enough for her to hear the words, "Stay out of this. Or next time we won't be so polite." And Charles, returning home alone, discovered his front door ajar. Inside, the house had been ransacked again. This time, they had torn apart Gloria's photo albums, scattering her life's memories across the floor. Charles knelt among the wreckage, his hands trembling as he picked up a torn photograph of Gloria holding their first child. The quiet rage that burned within him now threatened to consume him. He stood, his back straightening as he looked at the mess. "They think they can break us," he murmured, his voice low but steady. "But they don't know what we're made of." The following day, the battle took a more public turn. Joanna's latest article, exposing the depth of Central Horizon's corruption, hit the front page of the local paper. The story went viral, sparking outrage and drawing attention from national media. Protests erupted outside Central Horizon's headquarters, the crowd swelling with each passing hour. But the corporation fought back. Their lawyers filed lawsuits against Joanna, Marcus, and even Charles, accusing them of defamation and hacking. The accusations were baseless, but the intent was clear: to bury them under the weight of legal fees and fear. "They're trying to drown us," Joanna said during a late-night strategy meeting at Charles's house. "They want to make this so expensive and terrifying that we give up." Charles looked at her, his eyes fierce. "We're not giving up. Not now. Not ever." The tension escalated when Marcus made a breakthrough. Late one night, he uncovered an internal memo from Central Horizon's executives. It outlined their strategy in chilling detail. Target high-value properties in minority neighborhoods. Create financial instability. Use legal loopholes to expedite foreclosures. Profit from redevelopment. Marcus showed the memo to Charles and Joanna, his voice shaking with anger. "This isn't just business. This is warfare." Joanna nodded, her expression grim. "And we're in the middle of it." The chapter reached its climax when Joanna received a call from an unexpected ally. Diana Ortega, a former employee of Central Horizon, had read the article and wanted to meet. They arranged a clandestine meeting at a coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Diana arrived, her face pale and her hands trembling. "I worked in their records department," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw what they were doing. I kept copies." Joanna leaned forward. "You have evidence?" Diana nodded, sliding a flash drive across the table. "Emails, memos, financial records, enough to bury them, but you didn't get it from me." Joanna took the drive, her heart pounding. "Why are you doing this?" Diana's eyes filled with tears. "Because my mother lost her home to them. And because I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent." As the chapter drew to a close, Charles, Marcus, and Joanna reviewed the contents of the flash drive. The evidence was damning, a treasure trove of corruption, deceit, and greed. But with every revelation came a new risk. Central Horizon wouldn't go down without a fight. "They'll come for us harder now," Marcus said, his voice tight. "This changes everything." Charles nodded, his gaze steady. "Good," he said, "let them come. We're ready." Outside, the night was quiet, the stars obscured by thick clouds. But inside the Kingston home, the fire of resistance burned brighter than ever. The storm was coming, but they would not face it alone. Together, they were unbreakable. The morning was deceptively calm as Charles Kingston stepped onto his porch. Gloria's photograph tucked into his shirt pocket like a talisman. The weight of the fight ahead pressed on him. But it was Gloria's voice, soft yet unwavering in his memory, that steeled him. "They will try to erase you," she had once said, "but they can't erase the truth." Inside, Marcus was busy at the dining table, the glow of his laptop casting sharp shadows on his determined face. Joanna paced the living room, the flash drive from Diana Ortega clutched in her hand. "This is the key," she said, "but it's also a target on our backs." Charles sat heavily in his chair. his body tired but his spirit unyielding. If they're coming for us, let them come. We've got what we need to show the world what they are. The day began with a strategic meeting at the church. Reverend Thompson had called together the community, and the pews were packed with faces etched in worry but lit with determination. Charles stood before them, the weight of generations behind his words. They think they can scare us into silence, he said, his voice steady but filled with fire. But we're still here, and we're not afraid. Marcus took the pulpit next, projecting emails, memos, and financial records onto a screen. Gasps filled the room as the truth became undeniable. Central Horizon had orchestrated a web of deceit that reached into the courts, city offices, and even local law enforcement. Joanna followed, her voice cutting through the tension. This isn't just about land, she said. This is about power. They've been taking from us for generations, counting on us to stay quiet. But not this time. The crowd erupted into applause, their fear giving way to anger and resolve. But as the energy in the room rose, so did the stakes. That evening, as the group strategized in the church basement, a loud crash echoed from above. They rushed upstairs to find a brick thrown through a stained glass window, the jagged edges scattering light across the pews. Tied to it was a note: "Stop now, or you'll regret it." The room fell silent, the gravity of the threat sinking in. But Reverend Thompson stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "They can break our windows," he said, "but they can't break our spirit." The retaliation escalated quickly. The next morning, Charles received a call from his bank. "Mr. Kingston," the manager said, his tone clipped, "your accounts have been frozen pending an investigation into irregular activity." Marcus faced his own setback when his car was towed without warning. Unpaid tickets, the officer claimed, though Marcus knew it was a lie. Joanna, meanwhile, discovered her editor had been pressured to drop her stories. Central Horizon's lawyers threatening a lawsuit. They're squeezing us from every side, Marcus said that night as they regrouped at Charles's house. But they're overplaying their hand. The more they push, the more desperate they look. Joanna nodded. And desperate people make mistakes. The breakthrough came 2 days later. Joanna received a call from Diana Ortega, the former Central Horizon employee who had provided the flash drive. "I've got more," Diana whispered, her voice trembling, "but I can't hold onto it anymore. It's too dangerous." They arranged to meet at a coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Diana arrived with a folder of documents, her hands shaking as she passed it to Joanna. "These are internal communications," she said. "They detail how they targeted your family, Charles, and others like you." "Why are you doing this?" Charles asked, his voice heavy with gratitude. Diana's eyes filled with tears. "Because my mother lost her home to people like them. I couldn't save her, but maybe this will save someone else." That night, Joanna, Marcus, and Charles pored over the new evidence. The documents painted a chilling picture of calculated greed and systemic racism. Internal memos detailed how Central Horizon had identified vulnerable black neighborhoods, manipulating tax codes and court rulings to force families out. "This isn't just corruption," Marcus said, his voice tight. "This is a blueprint for theft." Joanna's fingers flew across her keyboard as she compiled the evidence into a story that would be impossible to ignore. "They wanted to erase these families, these histories," she said, "but we're going to make sure the whole world sees them." The chapter's tension reached its peak when Marcus's phone buzzed with a notification. A video had been sent to his email, a grainy clip of Joanna leaving Diana's apartment, followed by a shadowy figure entering. Moments later, the apartment erupted in flames. The three stared at the screen in horror. "They're trying to send a message," Joanna said, her voice shaking, "but they've just confirmed everything we need to take them down." Charles stood, his eyes blazing with resolve. "They think they can scare us into submission," he said, "but they've only shown us how afraid they are." As the night stretched on, the team worked tirelessly, preparing for the next stage of their fight. Outside, the city seemed quieter than usual, the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. But inside the Kingston home, the fire of justice burned brighter than ever. The fight was no longer just theirs. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been told to stay silent, to accept injustice as the cost of survival. And no matter how dangerous it became, they were ready. "They wanted us to disappear," Charles said, looking at Gloria's photograph on the mantle. "But we're going to make sure they remember us. And as dawn broke over the city, the battle lines were drawn. The storm was here, and the Kingstons would face it head-on. The day began with a grim silence that clung to the Kingston home like fog. The air inside felt heavy, charged with the weight of what they had seen the night before. Diana's apartment engulfed in flames. The charred remnants of her life a stark reminder of how far their adversaries would go to silence them. Charles sat at the kitchen table, Gloria's photograph propped against the sugar jar. Her smile, eternal and unwavering, was a comfort in a world that seemed determined to break him. Across the table, Marcus was deep into his laptop, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he dug deeper into the digital maze of corruption they were unraveling. Joanna paced the room, her phone buzzing with messages from reporters, allies, and worried family members. "We need to act," Joanna said, breaking the tense quiet. "This isn't just about evidence anymore. This is about survival." Charles nodded slowly, his hands clasped in front of him. "What do we have?" Marcus turned his screen toward them. "Everything. The memos, the transactions, the emails tying Central Horizon to Judge Redding and half the city's power brokers. But it's not enough to just release it, we need to make sure it lands where it can't be ignored." Joanna leaned against the counter, her brow furrowed in thought. "We need national attention. Local papers are too easy for them to control. If we get this story out on a bigger platform, it's game over for them." Charles's voice was quiet but firm. "Then let's do it." By midday, the group had mobilized. Joanna contacted a trusted colleague at a major news outlet, a veteran reporter who had built a career on exposing corruption. "You've got my attention," the reporter said after Joanna outlined the story. "Send me everything. If it checks out, I'll make sure it runs." Marcus, meanwhile, secured backups of all the evidence on encrypted servers, sending copies to multiple allies in case their systems were compromised. "They can't erase it if it's everywhere," he said. Charles took a different approach, reaching out to the community. He walked door to door, speaking to neighbors, many of whom had lived in the area for decades. His presence, a symbol of resilience and determination, drew people out of their homes and into the fight. "This isn't just about me," he told them. "It's about all of us. Our history, our families, our future." As the day progressed, tensions escalated. Joanna's article began circulating among journalists, sparking a flurry of interest and inquiries. Calls poured in from media outlets and advocacy groups, their voices eager and urgent. But the backlash was swift. Central Horizon's lawyers issued cease and desist letters to the news outlet preparing to publish the story, threatening lawsuits and reputational damage. Anonymous messages flooded Joanna's inbox, warning her to back off. Marcus received a cryptic email that chilled him to his core. "You're talented. Don't waste your future on this. Walk away while you can." And Charles, returning home from an afternoon meeting at the church, found his porch vandalized. The words, "Stay quiet," were spray-painted across the steps in bold, menacing letters. The breaking point came that evening when Joanna received a call from Diana. Her voice was shaky, her fear palpable. "They're watching me," Diana whispered. I think they know where I'm staying." Joanna's heart raced. "Diana, you need to get somewhere safe. Now." "I'm trying," Diana replied. "But I don't think I'll make it alone." Joanna and Marcus sprang into action, coordinating with local activists to secure a safe house for Diana. Meanwhile, Charles reached out to Reverend Thompson, who mobilized church volunteers to keep watch over vulnerable members of the community. The urgency of the moment left no room for hesitation. Every second felt like a battle against time, a fight to protect not just their evidence but their lives. As night fell, the Kingston home became a hive of activity. Allies filtered in and out, delivering updates, strategizing, and offering support. The dining room table, once a place of family meals and quiet reflection, was now covered in laptops, papers, and maps. Charles stood at the head of the table, his presence a calming force amidst the chaos. "They're trying to scare us because they know they're losing," he said, "but fear won't win this fight. Truth will." Joanna placed a hand on his shoulder. "And we've got more truth than they can handle." The climax of the chapter came in the early hours of the morning. The national news outlet Joanna had contacted published the story, complete with the evidence Marcus and Diana had uncovered. The headline was searing: "Corporate Greed and Judicial Corruption, the Systematic Erasure of Black Communities." Within hours, the story spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags trending as people across the country demanded accountability. Protests erupted outside Central Horizon's headquarters, the crowd growing with each passing hour. But the story did more than spark outrage, it emboldened others to come forward. Former employees of Central Horizon, residents who had been displaced, and even city officials began reaching out, their voices adding to the growing chorus of resistance. As dawn broke, Charles sat on his porch, watching the neighborhood come alive with a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of hope. Marcus joined him, a tired but triumphant smile on his face. "It's out there now," he said. "They can't bury it." Charles nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "They thought they could erase us," he said quietly, "but we're writing a story they'll never forget." And as the sun rose over the city, the fire they had started burned brighter than ever, lighting the way for others to follow. The storm had broken, but the winds of change were far from calm. In the days following the article's release, the Kingston household became a nerve center of activity. The phone rang incessantly, reporters seeking comments, neighbors offering support, and activists eager to join the fight. Charles, who had spent most of his life in quiet dignity, now found himself at the center of a battle that echoed far beyond his family's story. "Grandpa," Marcus said one evening, setting his laptop on the table, "the story's gone global. People are sharing it everywhere: Europe, Africa, even Australia. They're calling it a modern-day land grab." Charles nodded, his expression a mix of pride and weariness. "Good," he said, "let them see, let them all see." But visibility brought danger. Central Horizon, now cornered, doubled down on its tactics. Charles received a court summons, claiming he and Marcus had engaged in defamatory conduct by sharing confidential information. Joanna's editor was hit with a subpoena demanding her sources. And Diana, still in hiding, reported that her safe house had been approached by unknown men asking questions. Joanna slammed the summons down on the table during a late-night meeting. "They're trying to bury us in legal fees," she said. "It's a classic tactic: distract, delay, and intimidate." Marcus shook his head. "But they're making a mistake. The more they push, the more attention they bring to themselves. Attention doesn't pay for lawyers," Joanna countered. Reverend Thompson, who had joined them at the meeting, leaned forward. "We'll find the money," he said. "This community has always taken care of its own." The next day, Charles addressed a rally outside the courthouse. The crowd stretched for blocks, their voices a chorus of anger and determination. Signs read, "Justice for Kingston," and "End corporate greed." Charles stepped up to the microphone, his weathered face illuminated by the late afternoon sun. "They thought we would stay silent," he began, his voice steady and clear. "They thought they could take what's ours without a fight. But we're here to say no. No more. This land, this history, it's not just ours. It belongs to everyone who came before us and everyone who will come after us." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy palpable. But as Charles stepped down, he caught sight of a familiar figure in the crowd, a man in a dark suit. His eyes fixed on Charles with an unsettling intensity. It was a reminder that their fight was far from over. That night, the Kingston home was plunged into darkness. The power had been cut, and the silence that followed was deafening. Charles lit a lantern, its warm glow a small comfort against the oppressive night. "They're trying to scare us," Marcus said, his voice tense as he peered out the window. Charles placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Fear is their weapon," he said, "but we've faced worse." Joanna arrived soon after, her car headlights cutting through the dark. "They're escalating," she said, stepping inside. "I've got contacts working on securing protection for Diana and us. But it'll take time." Charles nodded, his face lined with resolve. "Time we don't have," he said, "so we keep moving forward." The next day, the community doubled down. A local law firm offered its services pro bono, and a coalition of activists launched a crowdfunding campaign to support the legal battle. Within hours, donations poured in, accompanied by messages of solidarity from across the country. Marcus, bolstered by the support, made another breakthrough. "I've been analyzing the financials again," he said during a late-night strategy session. "Central Horizon has been funneling money through a charity tied to Judge Redding. They've been using it to bribe officials and buy court rulings. Joanna's eyes widened. If we can prove that, we can bring them down. Marcus finished. But proving it required a risk. Diana, still in hiding, held the key documents. Joanna arranged a secret meeting in a public park. Their only option to avoid detection. Charles insisted on coming along. The park was quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. Diana arrived, her face pale but her eyes resolute. I can't do this anymore, she said, handing over a folder. This has to end. As Joanna and Marcus sifted through the contents, their expressions shifted from surprise to grim satisfaction. This is it, Joanna said. This is everything we need. But before they could leave, headlights cut through the darkness, and an unmarked car pulled up. A man stepped out, his suit immaculate and his smile cold. Good evening, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. You've been very busy. Charles stepped forward, placing himself between the man and Diana. You've been busy too, he said, but your time's running out. The man's smile faltered. I'd be careful if I were you. Mr. Kingston, people in your position have a habit of disappearing. Charles didn't flinch. I've lived through worse threats than yours, he said, and I'm still here. The chapter ended on a knife's edge. The evidence was in their hands, but the enemy was closing in. The line between hope and danger blurred, the stakes higher than ever. As the group drove away from the park, the weight of their mission settled over them. Charles looked out the window at the city lights, his voice low but firm. They've pushed us as far as they can. Now it's our turn. And as the car sped into the night, the fire of their fight burned brighter than ever, a beacon against the encroaching dark. The courtroom was packed, a heavy silence descending as the gavel struck against the oak bench. Charles Kingston sat at the plaintiff's table, Gloria's photograph tucked into his jacket pocket. Beside him, Marcus and Joanna reviewed their notes one last time, their faces tense with the weight of the evidence they were about to present. On the other side of the room sat representatives of Central Horizon, their lawyers polished and poised. Judge Redding, with his stern demeanor and carefully crafted neutrality, presided from the bench, but everyone in the room knew the stakes. This was more than a property dispute. This was a reckoning. The day began quietly, with Charles sitting on his porch, watching the sun rise. The peaceful moment felt like the calm before a storm. They'll throw everything they have at us today, he told Marcus, who joined him with a cup of coffee. Let them, Marcus replied. We've got the truth. That's more powerful than any lawyer they can buy. Charles nodded, though his heart was heavy. The truth, as powerful as it was, had been ignored too many times before. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Supporters filled the seats, their faces a tapestry of hope and defiance. Outside, protesters chanted, holding signs that read, "Justice for Kingston," and "Stop the land theft." When the trial began, Joanna took the stand first. Her calm, steady voice laid the foundation, recounting the history of Charles's land and the systematic targeting of black communities by Central Horizon. She presented emails, financial records, and internal memos, each piece painting a damning picture of corruption and greed. The defense tried to undermine her credibility. Ms. Harris, one lawyer sneered, "Are you an expert in corporate finance?" Joanna didn't flinch. "I'm an expert in exposing the truth," she replied, "and that's exactly what I've done here." Next, Marcus took the stand. His testimony was technical but devastating. He demonstrated how Central Horizon had manipulated tax records, falsified documents, and used shell corporations to hide their tracks. The courtroom was silent as he showed the digital trail leading directly to Judge Redding's financial accounts. The defense scrambled, accusing Marcus of hacking and tampering. But Marcus was prepared. "Every piece of data I've presented is from public records or legally obtained sources," he said. "The only people breaking the law here are the defendants." Charles was the final witness. The courtroom held its breath as he approached the stand. His gait slow but steady. His voice, deep and rich with the weight of decades, filled the room. "This isn't just about land," he began, holding Gloria's photograph for the court to see. "This is about history. My great-grandfather bought that land after emancipation, with money he earned through sweat and struggle. It was a promise, a piece of freedom he could give to his children and grandchildren. And now, these people want to take that away." He paused, his eyes meeting Judge Redding's. "But they're not just taking land. They're trying to take our dignity, our history, our place in this world. And we won't let them." The defense called Judge Redding to the stand, a move that electrified the courtroom. The once confident judge looked diminished, his carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of the evidence. "Your Honor," the prosecutor asked, "can you explain the deposits made to your charitable foundation from Central Horizon executives?" Redding hesitated, his hands trembling. "Those were legitimate donations," he stammered. "Legitimate donations," the prosecutor repeated, holding up a document. "In exchange for favorable rulings on property disputes?" The tension in the room was palpable as Redding struggled to answer. I never." The prosecutor pressed further. "Did you or did you not receive these payments, knowing they were intended to influence your decisions?" Redding's silence was deafening. The crowd murmured, the weight of the moment sinking in. Outside the courthouse, the protests swelled. News cameras captured every moment, the story dominating headlines. The pressure on Central Horizon grew unbearable as more employees came forward with evidence, each testimony adding to the avalanche of accountability. Diana Ortega, still in hiding, submitted a written statement detailing her role in preserving crucial documents. "I stayed silent for too long," she wrote, "but the courage of the Kingstons gave me the strength to speak." The day's climax came as the jury deliberated. Hours passed, each second dragging like an eternity. Charles sat with Marcus and Joanna, their hands clasped together in silent prayer. When the jury returned, the foreman stood, his expression unreadable. "In the matter of Kingston versus Central Horizon," he began, "we find in favor of the plaintiff." The courtroom erupted into cheers, the energy overwhelming. Charles closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face as he clutched Gloria's photograph. "We did it," he whispered. "We kept our promise." As the chapter ended, the victory felt monumental but bittersweet. Central Horizon's empire was crumbling, but the fight for justice was far from over. Outside, the crowd roared, their chants echoing through the streets. Charles stood on the courthouse steps, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't the end," he told the crowd. "This is just the beginning. For every family, every community they've tried to erase, we'll keep fighting, because this land, this history belongs to us." And as the sun set over the city, the Kingstons' victory became a beacon of hope for others, a testament to the power of truth in the face of overwhelming odds. The storm had passed, but its winds had sown the seeds of change. The courthouse steps still echoed with the chants of victory as the Kingstons and their allies returned home. But as the initial euphoria of the courtroom victory faded, a sobering reality set in. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. Charles Kingston sat in his living room that evening, Gloria's photograph on the mantel, bathed in the soft glow of a nearby lamp. The house was quiet, but the stillness carried a heavy weight. Marcus entered, his laptop tucked under his arm and his face a blend of exhaustion and determination. "They're not done, Grandpa," Marcus said, setting the laptop on the coffee table. "Central Horizon's already filing appeals, and their PR machine is in full swing. They're painting themselves as the victims, claiming they're just trying to revitalize the community." Charles nodded slowly. "That's what they always do. Shift the narrative, twist the truth, and try to make us look like the problem." Joanna joined them, dropping a stack of papers on the table. "They're also pushing back harder than ever. Legal filings, smear campaigns, even threatening other families who might want to come forward. They're trying to scare people into silence." The next day, Charles and Marcus visited the church, where Reverend Thompson had called a meeting to discuss the next steps. The sanctuary, once filled with voices of prayer and defiance, now held a quieter energy, a mix of hope, anxiety, and resolve. Charles stood before the congregation, his voice calm but firm. "This victory wasn't just for my family. It was for every family that's ever been pushed out, every community that's ever been erased. But they're still coming for us. This isn't over." Reverend Thompson stepped forward, placing a hand on Charles's shoulder. "We need to stay united," he said. "They'll try to divide us, to make us turn on each other. But our strength is in our community." The threats began to escalate. Anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes, warning residents to distance themselves from the Kingstons. Joanna received a call from her editor, who had been pressured to cut ties with her. "They're saying we're risking lawsuits if we keep running your stories," he said. "We can't afford that." Joanna's response was resolute. "If you won't publish them, I'll find someone who will." Meanwhile, Marcus uncovered evidence that Central Horizon was funneling money into local political campaigns, trying to buy influence to counteract the negative press. They're trying to lock us out of the system entirely, he told Charles. They want to make sure this can't happen again. One evening, Charles returned home to find his front porch vandalized again, this time with the words, "Traitor to Progress," painted in bold red letters. The sight was a gut punch. But Charles didn't falter. Instead, he called Marcus and Joanna, and they spent the night scrubbing the paint away. As they worked, Charles spoke softly, his words carrying the weight of generations. They think progress means erasing us. But real progress doesn't come at the expense of people's lives and histories. We've got to remind them of that. The tension reached a breaking point when Diana Ortega, still in hiding, revealed that she had been contacted by federal investigators. They're looking into Central Horizon's activities across multiple states, she told Joanna in a secure phone call. But they need more testimonies. More evidence. Joanna relayed the news to Charles and Marcus, who immediately began reaching out to other families affected by Central Horizon's schemes. It wasn't easy. Many were afraid, worn down by years of fighting or reluctant to trust the system that had failed them before. But one by one, the families began to speak out. Their stories painted a damning picture of systemic exploitation, each account adding fuel to the fire of accountability. The media picked up on the growing momentum, and public opinion began to shift decisively. The chapter's climax came during a town hall meeting, where Central Horizon had planned to present their redevelopment plan as a solution for the community. Charles, Marcus, Joanna, and dozens of their supporters attended, filling the room with an undeniable presence. The company's representatives spoke first, their words polished and practiced. They touted their investments, their commitment to modernization, and their plans to create opportunities for the neighborhood. When it was Charles's turn to speak, the room fell silent. He stood slowly, his presence commanding. "You talk about opportunities," he said, his voice steady. "But what about the opportunities you've stolen? What about the families you've displaced? The histories you've erased? You call it progress, but it's just theft with a prettier name." The room erupted into applause, the community's anger and defiance on full display. One by one, others stood to share their stories, their voices rising together to drown out the corporation's hollow promises. As the meeting ended, Charles stood outside, watching the crowd disperse. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt the tide turning in their favor. Marcus joined him, his expression hopeful but cautious. "They're going to keep coming at us," Marcus said. "This isn't the kind of fight you win overnight." Charles nodded. "I know, but every step we take, every voice we raise, brings us closer to justice. And that's worth fighting for." The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that vibrates with anticipation. Charles Kingston sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped in front of him. On the bench, a federal judge peered down at the assembly, his expression unreadable. To Charles's left, Marcus worked intently on his laptop, while Joanna shuffled through her notes. The air was heavy, electric, as if the entire room was holding its breath. This was the moment everything had led to, the culmination of months of struggle, fear, and defiance. Central Horizon's vast machinery of corruption, its network of bribery, and its attempts at erasure were all on trial. And so was the resilience of a community that refused to be silenced. The day began quietly, as many fateful days do. Charles woke before dawn, sitting on his porch as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. He held Gloria's photograph in his hands, the edges worn from months of being carried close to his heart. "I hope you're watching, Gloria," he murmured. "I hope you see what you helped build." By the time Marcus and Joanna arrived, the house was already buzzing with activity. Allies filtered in and out, offering updates and encouragement. Reverend Thompson stopped by, leading a quiet prayer that filled the room with a sense of calm determination. "You're not just fighting for yourselves," he said, his voice steady. "You're fighting for every family, every story, every piece of history they've tried to bury." At the courthouse, the atmosphere was charged. Protesters lined the steps, their chants echoing through the air. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras capturing the sea of signs and faces demanding justice. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity, the tension almost tangible. The trial began with the prosecutor presenting the evidence Marcus had painstakingly compiled: financial records, internal memos, and testimonies from former employees. Each piece was a nail in the coffin of Central Horizon's defense. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, holding up one of the memos, "this document outlines a deliberate strategy to target vulnerable communities, falsify tax records, and exploit legal loopholes. It's not just unethical, it's illegal." The defense tried to push back, accusing the plaintiffs of hacking, tampering, and spreading falsehoods, but Marcus was prepared. He took the stand, explaining in clear, precise language how he had uncovered the evidence. "They didn't just break the law," he said, "they built an entire system designed to hide their crimes." As the trial continued, Joanna testified about the human cost of Central Horizon's actions. She described families torn apart, histories erased, and communities uprooted. "These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "These are lives. These are people who built their neighborhoods with their own hands, only to have them stolen by greed." When Charles took the stand, the courtroom fell silent again. His voice, deep and steady, carried the weight of generations. "My family's story isn't unique," he began. "It's the story of countless black families who dared to dream, who dared to build, and who were punished for it. But we're still here, and we're not going anywhere." Outside the courthouse, the protests swelled as the trial drew national attention. Civil rights leaders, politicians, and ordinary citizens joined the crowd, their presence a powerful reminder that this fight resonated far beyond one neighborhood. The tension reached its peak when Central Horizon's CEO, forced to testify under subpoena, took the stand. His polished demeanor faltered under cross-examination as damning evidence piled up. "Isn't it true," the prosecutor asked, "that your company knowingly targeted black communities because they were less likely to have the resources to fight back?" The CEO hesitated, his silence more damning than any admission. The climax came as the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was so quiet that Charles could hear the faint ticking of the courtroom clock. When the foreman stood, the weight of the moment was almost unbearable. "In the case of Kingston versus Central Horizon," the foreman said, "we find in favor of the plaintiff." The room erupted in cheers, the sound a cathartic release of months of tension and fear. Charles closed his eyes, his hands trembling as he clutched Gloria's photograph. Marcus embraced him, tears streaming down his face. "We did it, Grandpa," he said, "we did it." But the victory didn't end in the courtroom. The verdict sparked a wave of accountability. Federal investigations were launched into other companies using similar tactics. Laws were passed to protect vulnerable communities, ensuring that what happened to the Kingstons would never happen again. Joanna's reporting won national awards. But more importantly, it inspired communities across the country to stand up and fight back. Diana Ortega, finally free from hiding, became a whistleblower advocate, helping others expose corruption. And Charles, his fight finally over, turned his attention to the future. The land that had been taken from his family was returned, and he dedicated it to the community, creating a center for education, history, and advocacy. The chapter ended with Charles standing on his reclaimed land, watching as children played in the garden and families gathered for a celebration. The air was filled with laughter and music, a stark contrast to the silence that had once threatened to engulf them. Gloria's photograph hung in the community center, her smile a reminder of the love and resilience that had carried them through. Charles touched the frame, his voice soft but firm. "We didn't just win, Gloria," he said, "we built something that will last." And as the sun set, casting the land in golden light, it was clear that the fight for justice had planted seeds that would grow for generations to come.